stress into that human, and of course the brain stem controls the brain stress system. So basically it pumps out neurochemicals which get the brain into a highly stressed state. Now, all human decision-making is not made from the cortex, but the limbic system. So we make all decisions from the emotional brain, and then we rationalize afterwards. Now, if you have the reptilian brain in a high state of stress, it means that the emotional brain is constantly interfering with the cortex, and you lower the IQ of the population.
Right.
So by this means, you can turn a large number of the alphas and the leaders into drones by having, for example, what would you have, a world financial meltdown which hits the alphas and the leaders who are the people who are suddenly worried about their job while before they weren't. Secondly, the reptilian brains are linked together, so when we have a group of humans who are highly stressed and agitated, and we produce something called a mob, the mob acts as a single entity. This has been studied and is well known, but we have telepathic communication between these humans who also display a very limited intelligence. So we're turning the humans into a pack of drones. Now, we can see that the financial meltdown was orchestrated by the Rothschilds at the same time as we bring along the Pharaoh, Mr. Hussein Obama. Now, Obama has been linked into the Pharaoh from the Pharaoh's line from the past, and therefore one can see by the 100th idiot, one can actually bring that ability to get humans doing what the Pharaoh wanted. You can bring it to the future.
Right.
As long as Mr. Hussein Obama is of the bloodline of the Pharaohs. So it's very important that somewhere in his past he has that bloodline. And if you link him to the whites, then you can actually infect the whites with this virus, which makes the alphas and the leaders turn into drones. And if you've got, for example, the black heritage, you can make the blacks worship him as well, and the alphas and the leaders give up their so-called leadership qualities and become slaves to the pharaoh. Now, there's a whole science that the Egyptians developed in order to reinforce this means of turning the 15% into the 85%. And producing a mindless mob mentality, which became permanent. Because if you can get 100% of the population acting as a mob controlled by the pharaoh, then you can have a new world order which can last the same length of time as the Egyptians, 5,000 years. And if you can have him having Ashkenazi blood, then if he is sacrificed ritually, then of course you can pass this 100 idiots power on to the authorities who take over after the so-called pharaoh is ritually sacrificed. So you can see that what the Rothschilds wish to do is bring in the pharaonic means of controlling humans, the basic hive mentality, and any of the alphas and leaders who don't become drones, of course, have to be carted away, and you have to stop them breeding because they would be a danger to the race. So one must have some means of carting them away and basically stopping them breeding. So one can see that the so-called FBI's list and the various other so-called means aren't there just to scare people, but actually if the Rothschilds are going to bring in this total and utter enslavement of mankind via the use of the mob mentality in humans, then of course they need to eliminate those few who don't go under the fluence of the mob. And
working with them, Tim, and very interesting. One of the papers, the Telegraph, perhaps had the story. You talk about the alpha or the achievers, the leaders,
yes,
having to be subjugated.
Yes.
the society and peer pressure is working hand in hand with this game plan, because the brighter young British students in middle school are now literally dumbing themselves down in order so that they may surround themselves and have friends.
Exactly. Now, it's worse than that, because there's a scientist called Edelman who proved that the brain isn't fixed, but actually the neurons in the brain are constantly competing on a Darwinian evolutionary basis, so that if you practice a behavior for long enough, it becomes set in the neurons. So it doesn't only happen up to the 5 years of age, but after 5 years of age, the neurons still compete. So people who are acting in a certain way for long enough set their neuronic network into that new profile. So the bright children who act dumb eventually become permanently dumb because of the research of Dr. Edelman, who was a neuroscientist of the highest caliber. So all this stuff is well known to the Rothschilds, and we must have a means of turning the Western population into complete imbeciles, so the 100th idiot mimetic effect is dominant, and by that means we can control the population, and the few that refuse to become drones must be eliminated.
They just removed. All right, we'll be right back with Tim in just a couple of minutes. Okay, and we are back. What you see going on all around you is precisely mirrored in Tim Rifat's words and analysis. And just look at some of the pictures of the pharaohs, some of the reliefs, some of the sculptures on the temples and so forth, and project Mr. Obama there. I think you can see that he would make a Hollywood Central casting pharaoh type. Interesting.
Now we come to the communism bit and the Ashkenazi blood, in that the other modern potentate who went along the pharaonic lines was a guy called Stalin, who was the bastard child, I think, of a Rothschild, born in Georgia, a Talmudic Satanist of the worst order. And he so turned the Russian state into a state of drones that when the NKVD, who were Talmudic Satanist killers, torturers, came to Leningrad, 25% of the population were taken away to be tortured to death in the gulags, and none of them fought. So you can imagine they just meekly were carted away in the Black Mariahs off to the gulags without any sort of fight in them. Now, if you can link the pharaoh from Egyptian times to the modern day ruler of the world, the Talmudic Satanist Stalin, who is a Rothschild, then of course you can bridge and link the Rothschilds into taking over from the pharaohs. So he has to be a communist. He has to be indoctrinated into communism. He has to turn America into a communist state by making all the debts of the mainly Talmudic Satanist bankers public, making all the profits private, because, of course, all the money in a pharaonic civilization goes to the pharaoh, and all the rest live as slaves, apart from the high priests, who keep the mob mentality in the population. And one can then see that the Ashkenazi blood links him to Stalin, and we can then flip from the Egyptian pharaoh type to the Rothschild pharaoh type, which is the Stalin, where we can have a constant state of terror. Why do we have a constant state of terror in a Stalinist state? Well, that's because if you, in nonlinear dynamics, so-called chaos theory, known to the public as the butterfly effect, we can, in a biological system which you start to stress, it goes from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16, but then it goes into a strange attractor, the mob state. And if you can define the initial states well enough, you can judge the mob state. So if you can start have, for example, a absolute pharaonic command in a society where the ruler has absolute power, absolute like Stalin, absolute like the pharaoh, then of course you can generate a mob by keeping them in a state of constant terror by use of the NKVD or Homeland Security, or, for example, the British police who beat the population to death.
Right.
You can keep them in a state of terror, which allows the mob